Hey, this is Stu. Now, maybe you've heard of Magic Bullet Denoiser, but today I'm going to talk to you about an exciting new member of the Magic Bullet family, Magic Bullet Renoiser. Now, whether you've denoised your footage, or maybe you started with some computer graphics rendering, or even shot with a camera that was perfectly noise-free, we oftentimes like to add just a little touch of film-like noise or grain to add texture just before we output our final project. I'm going to grab Renoiser and apply it to this clip. Now this clip was shot on the ARRI Amira, and it is super clean. Really beautiful shot, but it just needs a little bit of film-like texture. And to help us see what we're doing here, I'm going to zoom in. I'll turn Renoiser off and back on again, and you can see that the default settings are really subtle. Let's go through the settings and see what our options are here. The first group of controls are about sharpening. Now, why include sharpening in a tool about adding noise? Well, the truth is you usually want to do both as a final step when you're creating your output of your video. A little bit of sharpening goes a long way to help make sure that your video looks great, whether it's in broadcast or on the web. You want to do a tasteful amount of sharpening, and you usually want to sharpen only the edges so that you don't enhance any funny noise or artifacts that may exist in your footage. So Renoiser has a really powerful sharpening control. If you turn it up a little bit, you can see that we'll bring out some of the detail in her eyes. And this footage, again, because it was shot so clean on the Amira, it really doesn't need much, but every shot benefits from a little bit. And then what I can do is turn up sharpen edges only to make sure that I'm only sharpening the sharp details that want to be even sharper. So here it is without, here it is with. I'm keeping this really subtle here. Okay, that's sharpening. Now let's get into grain. So the most important control is grain amount, and the default is 25%. I can crank it up to 100, and you can see a lot more visible grain. I can even scrub it past 100 up to 200 and get a lot of grain. But probably what you're going to want to do is look at our presets. So the next control here is grain preset. The default is modern master, and that's meant to mimic the look of a 35mm master made from modern filmmaking techniques. The next one up is cinema holdout, and that's a little bit more grain and a little bit more texture. We've got a lot of choices here. Big Kahuna is sort of a 90s action movie look. Kung Fu Fighting is sort of a 70s Kung Fu movie style look. Park City is like an indie movie that was maybe a little bit more grainy in terms of its processing before it made its way to the film festival circuit. You may be able to guess where some of these other inspirations came from. Some of them are based on real film stocks, like for instance 16mm, which is a big chunky grain, and if you want to see some mega grain, choose the Super 8 preset. Now maybe you're starting to notice something important here. The grain that Renoiser creates is not just a layer that is applied on top of your image. We are actually rebuilding your image out of virtual grain. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, what you'll notice here is on her face, the edges of her, say, cheek here are actually getting broken apart by the grain. And that is controlled by a couple of sliders down here under grain settings. The first is size and the second is texture. And in Super 8, they're both cranked up a lot. But I'm going to pick a more subtle one here. Let's pick Hadley's Hope. So Hadley's Hope has a size of 55%. If I crank that up, you can see that the image really does appear to be built out of this grain. And if I increase this texture control here, you'll see that even more profoundly. What that can do is it can actually take sharp edges and have the grain push the colors past the boundaries. And that's what I mean by texture. It's the fact that the image is not just your image with some grain slapped on top with the transfer mode. It's really your pixels getting pushed around as if the image itself was made out of chunks of grain. Now, for a preset like Super 8, where the grain is gigantic, that really matters a lot in terms of realism. But for the others, like let's just say modern 35mm, it's just a really subtle thing. You know, texture on this one's set to 50, size is only 15. Grain is kind of a funny thing. There's a lot of je ne sais quoi in grain. Like, you feel it more than you see it. In fact, on a still frame, it's almost impossible to detect. But it matters. The right grain applied to your project can add a unifying texture that makes the whole thing feel like it was shot on the same film stock, even if you used a bunch of crazy different digital cameras, especially if you're denoising beforehand. There's a couple other controls here. One is called log grain. This just controls what color space the grain is generated in. You can adjust that to taste. And then monochrome grain is the right choice if you're applying grain to a black and white image. Now, these presets are adjusting a bunch of controls, and those are hidden down here in tonal range and channels. So for every type of grain, you can adjust the amount and size individually in red, green, and blue channels, and how much the grain is visible in the highlights, midtones, and shadows. So you can see if I choose Big Kahuna, I get different values down here. If I choose Classic 35mm, again, different values down here. But all of them are easily adjustable to taste using the grain amount slider. So you are always in control over the final look. And of course, you can make these adjustments yourself, save it as your own preset, and really customize your approach to adding grain. Now, we've been talking about grain, but I also want to talk about noise. Sometimes maybe you don't want your image to appear grainy as if it was shot on film. Sometimes you just want a little bit of noise. Now, why do you want to add noise to your image? Well, if you've ever seen like a film production company logo come up on a heavily compressed movie and have a lot of banding, you've seen what not having noise can do to an image. If your video is going to be seen online, like on YouTube, compressed through some sort of pipeline that you don't know much about, a little bit of noise applied on output can really help things along. It forces the compression algorithms to work a little bit harder, and it keeps them from taking the easy way out. So we have a few presets for this. One is light noise, and I'm going to apply this, and you're barely even going to be able to see it on her face here. This one I love. It's called Image Vitamins. A friend of mine once told me that noise is like image vitamins. It just makes your image more robust, more solid, more able to withstand subsequent abuse. So Image Vitamins is a great preset to use if you are not sure what's going to happen to your video after you hand it off. And then along those same lines, we've got compression proofing. This is a much more visible noise, and this will make sure that no brutal compression algorithms can turn your smooth gradients into ugly banding, lay it farther down the line. You can also find Renoiser inside of Magic Bullet Looks 4. It's here in the Post category, Renoiser. All the same controls, all the same presets. And many of the over 50 new looks that come with Magic Bullet Looks 4.0 use Renoiser to create a nice filmic texture. The last thing you need to know about Renoiser is that it's optimized for Mercury playback. It plays back in real time in Premiere. It's also smart about your playback resolution, so if you set it to a low resolution, like here I'm at half, or if you set it to quarter, it's not going to work as hard just for that playback preview, so that you always get the best possible performance, but when you go to render the final high-quality version, you get all that subtle, amazing detail. So that's Magic Bullet Renoiser, an incredibly powerful tool with handy presets for creating film-like grain with a realism that has never been achieved before, or for just adding a subtle amount of noise to make sure that your image survives subsequent compression or generation loss.